On the night of March 27 to 28, 1942, the Royal Navy and British commandos executed one of the most audacious raids of the entire Second World War. Their target was the Normandy dock at St Nazaire, the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast large enough to accommodate the German battleship Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was Hitler's most fearsome surface raider, a 42,000-ton behemoth armed with 8 15-inch guns that threatened the entire Allied convoy lifeline across the North Atlantic. As long as the Normandy dock remained operational, the Tirpitz could sortie from her Norwegian fjord sanctuary, break into the Atlantic shipping lanes, and if damaged, sail south to St Nazaire for repairs. Prime Minister Winston Churchill made the destruction of the dock an absolute priority, declaring that eliminating this facility was a matter of the highest importance. The planning fell to Combined Operations Headquarters under Lord Louis Mountbatten, who assigned the mission to Brigadier Charles Hayden and Captain Robert Ryder of the Royal Navy. Their concept was breathtakingly bold. They would sail an obsolete American destroyer packed with explosives directly into the dock gate, ramming it at full speed. Commandos would then land to destroy the pumps, winding gear, and other infrastructure while the delayed action fuse ticked down on the destroyer's explosive cargo. No one had ever attempted anything quite like it, a shipborne suicide attack on one of the most heavily defended ports on the French coast. The dock was defended by over 200 heavy guns and anti-aircraft batteries, searchlights, patrol boats, and 5,000 German troops. The port of St Nazaire lay 6 miles up the Loire estuary, requiring a perilous navigation through shallow, mine-strewn waters under the guns of coastal batteries. The planners estimated that the chances of survival were no better than 50-50, yet the volunteers for the mission were oversubscribed 3 times over. Every man who embarked knew he was part of something extraordinary, a raid so daring that if it succeeded, it would change the balance of naval power in the Atlantic. The operation was codenamed Chariot, and its success would hinge on split-second timing, absolute surprise, and the raw courage of men willing to sacrifice themselves for a single, decisive blow. The raid would also serve a broader strategic purpose. The destruction of the Normandy dock would effectively neutralize the Tirpitz as a threat, forcing the German Navy to keep their most powerful surface asset in Norwegian waters where it could be contained by the home fleet. This calculation was central to Churchill's insistence on the operation, as every convoy to the Soviet Union and every supply run across the Atlantic was vulnerable to a Tirpitz sortie. The dock's destruction would be worth whatever price the British were forced to pay in men and material. The planning phase of Operation Chariot involved an extraordinary level of secrecy and attention to detail. Commander Ryder and Lieutenant Colonel Newman spent weeks studying aerial reconnaissance photographs of the St Nazaire docks, memorizing every crane, every building, every possible position for German gun emplacements. Models of the dockyard were constructed in a secure warehouse on the south coast of England, where the commandos rehearsed their roles repeatedly until every man could navigate the dockyard blindfolded. The demolition teams practiced attaching charges to mock-ups of the pumping machinery, timing themselves against a stopwatch. The naval crews drilled the approach maneuvers in the Thames estuary, simulating the narrow, winding channel of the Loire. The selection of the fuse timing was itself a critical decision: too short, and the commandos would still be in the dockyard when the explosives detonated; too long, and the Germans would have ample time to defuse them. The engineers settled on a delay of 2.5 hours, hoping this would give the raiders enough time to escape while ensuring the Germans would not have time to organize a thorough search of the wreck. Every man who volunteered was told the truth about the odds against them. Not one withdrew. The spirit of the operation was captured in the words of one commando who wrote home, "If I do not return, know that I died doing something that matters." The force assembled for Operation Chariot consisted of HMS Campbeltown, a 50-year-old American destroyer transferred under the Lend-Lease program, plus 16 motor launches carrying 265 commandos of No. 2 Commando. Campbeltown was radically modified for the mission. Her 4 funnels were cut down to 2 to resemble a German Maut-class destroyer, her hull was reinforced, and her forward section was packed with 4.5 tons of timed explosives buried in concrete. The fuses were set to detonate at 0630 hours on March 28, giving the attackers time to escape. On the evening of March 26, the force slipped out of Falmouth Harbor flying the German ensign as a ruse. The weather was calm with moderate visibility as they steamed south across the Bay of Biscay. At 0840 on March 27, a German trawler challenged them, but the British quickly flashed a recognition signal and continued unchallenged. As dusk fell, the force rendezvoused at sea, formed a single line ahead, and began their final approach up the Loire estuary. The defenses around St Nazaire were formidable: shore batteries with 170mm and 280mm guns, searchlights along both banks, and a boom defense net across the harbor entrance. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman led the commandos while Ryder conned Campbeltown through the perilously shallow channel. The tension on board was almost unbearable as the flotilla crept forward into the darkened estuary, every man aware that discovery meant almost certain destruction. The German garrison at St Nazaire numbered over 5,000 troops, including experienced naval gunners, infantry units, and the crews of several warships in the harbor. The British force of just over 600 men would be outnumbered almost 10 to 1, but they relied on the element of surprise and the sheer audacity of their plan. As midnight approached, the raiders could see the lights of St Nazaire glimmering in the distance. The dockyard cranes and the massive form of the Normandy dock came into view. Every man knew his role: the demolition parties, the covering teams, the boat crews, and each had rehearsed his part until it was second nature. The next hour would decide whether Operation Chariot would be remembered as one of the greatest raids in history or a tragic footnote of failed bravery. The motor launches, known as MLs, were particularly vulnerable. They were wooden-hulled, unarmored, and packed with petrol. A single hit could turn them into fireballs. The commandos aboard them knew the odds were against them, yet not a single man requested transfer to a different vessel. The approach to St Nazaire was a masterclass in deception and nerve. The German ensign flying from Campbeltown's mast was the key element of the ruse. British intelligence had confirmed that no German destroyer was expected in the area, but the sight of a warship flying the swastika often caused harbor defenses to hesitate just long enough for identification to be delayed. The radio operators on board Campbeltown maintained a constant traffic of false radio signals, mimicking German naval communications to confuse any intercept stations that might be listening. The motor launches followed in two columns, their engines muffled to reduce noise. As the force entered the estuary, the commandos could see the German searchlights sweeping across the water. Each man checked his weapons, his demolition charges, and his escape kit. Many wrote final letters to their families, trusting that they would be found and delivered if the worst happened. The orders were clear: no man was to surrender until all ammunition was expended, and every prisoner was expected to attempt escape at the first opportunity. The Germans had established a system of alerts and responses that could have any incoming vessel engaged within minutes. The fact that the British force managed to approach within sight of the dock before being challenged was a testament to the skill of the navigators and the audacity of the deception plan. At 0122 hours on March 28, German searchlights suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the approaching flotilla. A sentry on the harbor mole had spotted the shadowy shapes and raised the alarm. The shore batteries opened fire with devastating effect, sending shells screaming across the water. Campbeltown replied with her Oerlikon cannons as shells screamed overhead, throwing up towering plumes of water that drenched the decks. Undeterred, Ryder held course and ordered full speed ahead. Campbeltown crashed through the anti-torpedo net at 0128 hours and 30 seconds later. At 0134, she rammed the southern gate of the Normandy dock at 19 knots. The impact threw men forward across the decks, crushing the bows of the ship against the massive caisson, but Campbeltown had lodged herself precisely as planned, her bows embedded deep in the dock gate. Commandos swarmed ashore immediately, scrambling down ladders and ropes under intense machine gun and mortar fire. Lieutenant Chant's party raced 400 yards across the dockyard to the pumping station, dodging between storage sheds and overhead cranes as bullets ricocheted off the concrete around them. They planted demolition charges that destroyed the massive pumps with a roar that echoed across the harbor. Other teams demolished the winding house, the crane controls, and the bridge. Marine Corps Sergeant Haynes led the successful destruction of the dock's operating machinery, while Lieutenant Purdon's men placed explosives on the harbor's power station. All the while, the German defenders rallied, pouring fire down on the raiders from the surrounding buildings and from behind overturned railway wagons. The motor launches attempting to extract the commandos came under concentrated shellfire. One after another was hit and set ablaze, their petrol tanks erupting in balls of orange flame that lit the harbor like daylight. Of the 16 launches that had started the mission, only one escaped back to England. The survivors fought desperately towards the escape rendezvous points, but German troops closed in from all sides. Newman's men made a fighting retreat toward the Old Mole, their designated evacuation point, only to find no boats waiting. With ammunition running low and casualties mounting, they formed a defensive perimeter behind a row of railway carriages and prepared for a last stand, knowing that dawn would bring no rescue. The commandos fired off their last magazines as the Germans encircled them, hurling grenades and firing from windows and rooftops. Newman ordered the final radio message back to England. The dock had been rammed, the demolition parties had succeeded in their objectives, and the survivors were surrounded and awaiting capture. The chaos of the battle inside the Normandy dock was captured in the accounts of surviving commandos. Men ran through clouds of acrid smoke, tripping over debris and fallen comrades, while tracer rounds crisscrossed the darkness in every direction. The demolition teams worked with desperate speed, their hands trembling from cold and adrenaline as they placed charges and lit fuses. The German response was initially disorganized. The sheer audacity of the attack had stunned the garrison. But within minutes, officers organized their men and began a systematic sweep of the dockyard. The commandos found themselves isolated in small groups, cut off from their escape routes by walls of fire and German machine gun positions that seemed to sprout from every corner. Corporal Donald Roy, a demolition specialist, managed to destroy 2 of the 3 dock operating houses before being pinned down by a German sniper. Sergeant Bertram Browse of the Royal Engineers led a party that demolished the dock's emergency pumping controls, ensuring that even if the main pumps survived, the dock could not be quickly restored. In the harbor, the motor launches that survived the initial barrage attempted to pick up survivors. ML-177 was hit repeatedly but managed to evacuate a group of commandos from the Old Mole before being sunk on. The return journey. Some of the most extraordinary acts of heroism went unrecorded. Men who were never seen again after volunteering for dangerous rearguard actions that allowed their comrades a few more precious seconds to escape. At 10:30 on March 28, the Germans brought their senior commanders aboard the beached Campbeltown to inspect the strange vessel. Hundreds of curious soldiers, dockworkers, and even civilian sightseers gathered around the embedded destroyer, wondering at the audacity of the British attack. A German officer climbed onto the bridge and examined the controls. Several soldiers posed for photographs on the deck. Below them, unknown to anyone, the 4.5 tons of explosives were still ticking down. At 1035 hours precisely, just a few minutes after the senior officers had stepped aboard, the explosives detonated in a cataclysmic blast that ripped the destroyer apart. The explosion hurled the forward section of Campbeltown 300 feet into the air and sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris towering over the dockyard. The blast wave flattened buildings within a quarter-mile radius and sent chunks of steel raining down across the port. An estimated 250 German personnel were killed instantly, including many of the senior officers who had been inspecting the ship. The Normandy dock was destroyed beyond repair for the remainder of the war, the caisson shattered, the gates twisted into scrap metal, and the pumping system reduced to rubble. The dry dock remained inoperative until 1947, by which time the war had been over for 2 years. The Tirpitz, deprived of her only Atlantic repair facility, was effectively trapped in Norwegian waters. She would be crippled by British midget submarines in Operation Source in September 1943 and finally sunk by Lancaster bombers of 617 Squadron using tallboy bombs in November 1944. The cost of Operation Chariot was severe. 144 British servicemen were killed, 318 were taken prisoner, and only 242 of the original 621 men returned to England. But the strategic gain was immense. The Tirpitz never again posed a real threat to Atlantic convoys. The raid earned 5 Victoria Crosses, including one for Captain Ryder and a posthumous award for Lieutenant Colonel Newman, who survived the war as a prisoner but never recovered from his wounds. 5 DSOs, 13 DSCs, and numerous other decorations were also awarded. The St Nazaire raid is still studied in military academies worldwide as the textbook example of a combined operation sabotage mission, proof that a small, determined force can achieve what armies of conventional troops cannot. The raid became known as the greatest raid of all, and its story continues to inspire generations of Special Forces soldiers who study its planning, execution, and extraordinary courage. The aftermath of Operation Chariot had repercussions far beyond the destruction of the dry dock. The Germans, humiliated by the success of the raid, launched a series of reprisals against French civilians in the St Nazaire region, arresting hundreds on suspicion of aiding the British. The commandos who were captured were treated harshly, many were interrogated by the Gestapo, and several were executed under Hitler's commando order of October 1942, which decreed that all captured commandos were to be shot without trial. The British government, while publicly celebrating the raid's success, privately mourned the loss of so many highly trained men. Newman survived the war and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his leadership. Ryder was also awarded the Victoria Cross, though he survived the war and retired as a rear admiral. The raid's influence on later special operations was profound. The techniques developed for Operation Chariot, the use of a disguised ship as a delivery mechanism for demolitions, the integration of naval and commando forces, the precision timing of multiple simultaneous attacks, became standard practice for combined operations. The St Nazaire raid demonstrated that even the most heavily defended targets could be destroyed by a small, well-trained force acting with speed and determination. It remains a landmark in the history of Special Forces operations, studied by the British SAS, the U.S. Navy SEALs, and every other elite military unit that trains for sabotage and direct action missions.